Atlantis, its name. It was called the Round Strong Isle and the Beautiful Callista. It had been the Thera until it had been called fancifully as Santorinos. Those who idolized Saint Irene, in reality, knocked against the nose, Santorinos, the sacred nose. Yet another jest on the part of the gods of Aegis, who had previously formed Crete in the shape of the monster maiden. However, not always had this island been a nose, more like a big snout, a round and splendid one with an elevated mountain in between, a mountain which turned out to be a volcano, fatal towards the entire Minoan civilization. First they bridged over the zones of sea and made a way to and from the royal palace which they built in the center island. This ancient palace was ornamented by successive generations, and they dug a canal which passed through zones of land from the island to the sea. The zones of earth were surrounded by walls made of stone of diverse colors, black and white and red, which they sometimes intermingled for the sake of ornament, and as they quarried they hollowed out beneath the edges of the zone's double docks, having roofs of rock. The outermost of the walls was coated with brass, the second with tin, and the third, which was the wall of the citadel, flashed with the red light of orichalcum, Plato, Critias. Here, on the island of Santorini, everything is pervaded with a 1,000-year-old legend about the vanished Atlantis. But what is Atlantis? Is it a historical reality, a mythological one, an esoteric one? And maybe the mystery of the defunct continent is not at all a whim of fancy, but a natural inner push towards an ancient homeland, not confirmed on the atlas of the earth. Atlantis has nonetheless firmly established itself inside the inner cosmos of man. At the same time, the search for it in the ocean had become a synonym of fruitless fantasies. However, Plato's Atlantis, just as was the case earlier with Homer's Troy, had nonetheless been found in spite of all the skeptics. When the Greek archaeologist Marinatus had excavated the Minoan colony on Santorini, which had lain undisturbed for 35 centuries, the world gasped with astonishment. The 30-meter-thick layer of ashes and lava had safely preserved the ancient city of Crete with its numerous priceless frescoes. What was gathered together from fragments on Crete turned out to be completely untouched here. The bright, luxuriant, refined civilization appeared into the world just as the beautiful Aphrodite, albeit not out of a sea form, but from the ashes of an ancient catastrophe. And the phoenix of hopes of discovering Atlantis has once again soared up into the clouds. Crete is too small to encompass it, the critic state, citing Plato. But Plato himself has discrepancies in regards to its size. In the division of the earth, Poseidon obtained as his portion the island of Atlantis. And there he begat children whose mother was a mortal. Towards the sea and in the center of the island there was a very fair and fertile plain. And near the center, about 50 stadia from the plain, there was a low mountain. In this fragment, Atlantis was seemingly copied from Crete. The plain of the Atlanteans is very similar to the valley of Knossos, let alone the moderately tall mountain in the middle. If following Solon's description, we would measure the island's size, we would see that its breadth comprises 38 kilometers, and this perfectly corresponds with the size of Crete. In another part of the text, Plato considerably expands the proportions, and the island transforms itself into a continent. But the country immediately about and surrounding the city was a level plain, itself surrounded by mountains which descended towards the sea. It was smooth and even, and of an oblong shape, extending in one direction 3,000 stadia. This part of the island looked towards the south and was sheltered from the north. Is it not too large for Crete? Yes, but it would suffice merely to change the scale of proportions, and the description of the mysterious land would correspond exactly to the island's southern valley of Messara. The figures of 1,000 and 100 are very similar in their language of the Cretans and the Egyptians. It would be quite easy for a copyist to confuse them, much easier than to find the traces of Atlantis under the ashes of 9,000 years. And so we approach Atlantis from the other side. Usually the traces of its existence are searched at 9 millennia prior to Solon, but maybe it might be worth to look for the traces of its departure, not 9 millennia, but 9 centuries before that point. The main point is that no matter where the land of the Atlanteans was situated, it perished in a horrifying natural cataclysm. Why would we not at first find a corresponding catastrophe? And then from it we could draw a line into the past, to the flourishing of the land of Poseidon, especially since one such catastrophe is well known. It was precisely the one that destroyed Santorinos. Its obviousness and its proportions could be seen in the very form of the island. After all, what the contemporary tourist sees in the place of Santorinos are merely fragments. The central portion of the island has simply disappeared, except that it did not sink into the deep waters as the mythical Atlantis, but scattered in ashes along the entire oikumena. And the generally accepted date of the catastrophe, the middle of the 15th century BC, stands exactly 9 centuries ahead of Solon, 1,450 years before Christ. These are not some misty Stone Age times. At that time the island had been surrounded by developed civilizations of Asia Minor, Egypt, Syria, and Mesopotamia. Could a cataclysm of those proportions have been left unnoticed? So, we have the island of Strongil, or Calliste. At that time it was still round and had a mountain in the middle of it, a steaming mountain, a volcano. On its slopes there were terraces, palaces, and temples, springs of hot and cold water. And then this whole giant mass bursts into the air, 200 billion tons. A volcano, similarly to long-range artillery, ejects ashes, magma, and smoke, not even into the atmosphere, but out into the open space at a height of 100 kilometers. The rumble from the explosion is heard for thousands of miles. But then the gunpowder runs out, the volcano fires one last shot, and into the formed chasm, onto the burning lava, hundreds of millions of tons of water fall. Another explosion happens, this time a mushroom of overheated water steam, dozens of times more intense than of the most powerful hydrogen bomb. And this whole dazzling and deafening spectacle is accompanied with earthquakes and overwhelming tsunamis. Devastating waves dash themselves on Crete. A gust of water rushes along the island's plains, sweeping away everything on its way, followed by one another and yet another one. The fertile layer of the soil is washed away. The cattle drown in the whirlpool. The flood demolishes houses and destroys the palace of Knossos. It's better not even to imagine what is going on at the source of the trouble itself at that time. If hell does exist, it's there.